You're on mute. You'll be on mute for the session. You can put your questions into either the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to the questions at the end. It's a 30-minute session, and we'll chat for 20 minutes before your questions. If there are no questions, we'll keep our conversation going. But please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A. I'll stop my sharing, and we will kick off with our guests. Christina from ecologiQ will introduce you, and we'll run the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Hi, everyone. Just to introduce myself, I am Christina Chin, Senior Advisor for Comms and Stakeholder Engagement at ecologiQ. Today, I'm very happy to be speaking with James Grenfell from the Australian Road Research Board, AARB, who is very experienced in the topic of glass in road infrastructure. So James, over to you. Why don't you just start by introducing yourself and just tell us a little bit about your involvement with recycled crushed glass?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. So as Christina said, my name's James Grenfell. I'm a principal professional within sustainability and materials performance at the Australian Road Research Board. And over the years, I've had a fair amount of involvement with looking at recycled crushed glass for transport infrastructure applications. I guess that started over here looking at recycled crushed glass in asphalt for what was at the time RMS New South Wales. Then looking at recycled crushed glass in asphalt wearing course for Brimbank City Council through Sustainability Victoria funding. Undertaking Austroads research to put together a recycled glass sand specification, and also putting together the evidence to support that development. And that was looking at recycled crushed glass in a number of applications, so bedding and backfill, embankment fill, landscaping, drainage layers, and also looking at for the use of fine aggregate replacement in concrete. And quite recently, we've had a project that's been looking at recycled crushed glass in granular pavement layers with a city council in New South Wales, so Canterbury Bankstown City Council, and that was blending recycled crushed glass with crushed concrete for use in a sub-base layer. We've also recently been involved with OmniGrip, looking at whether we could develop a high friction surface treatment incorporating recycled crushed glass by blending it with corundum, which is a very high friction aggregate and very wear resistant. So there's been quite a few things.
Yeah, well, that's not quite a few. That's quite a long list. Just the audience, just you might not know this, but before that, James wasn't wearing his glasses, and he was saying, "Oh, maybe if I put my glasses on, I'll look more like a bookworm." So certainly, I think so. You put your glasses on, and you've got this long list of projects that you're working on. James, why don't you elaborate a little bit? I know that you've done some work with Brimbank City Council, which you've mentioned, and that's led to some development of specs reform, some specification reform work. Maybe can you spend a bit of time in digressing on that?
Yeah. So I guess one of the areas that's often looked at more recently is recycled crushed glass in asphalt wearing course. Up until very recently, Vic DOT didn't allow recycled crushed glass in any of their wearing course mixes. I think historically there have been some trials maybe 15, 20 years ago, back in the days when recycled crushed glass wasn't processed as well and potentially had some larger, flakier particles. And I think they had some bad experiences, but it was something that Vic DOT were interested in revisiting. There was the opportunity to get a grant from Sustainability Victoria, work with Brimbank City Council with a view to laying a field trial, VicDOT were on board with this project as well in I guess a supervisory and overview type role. And they were very keen to see how recycled crushed glass would perform in asphalt wearing course. Actually, the project ended up having a few delays in terms of construction due to COVID and some other factors. But in the meantime, VicDOT actually changed their specification to allow up to 5% recycled crushed glass in wearing course. The trial has obviously still gone ahead. It's still of great interest to VicDOT because we've incorporated higher recycled crushed glass content. So we have 3 different mixes down. One of them is at 5%. We've got one that's around 8% recycled crushed glass and a further one that's up to 10% recycled crushed glass. So VicDOT are still interested in how these sections are performing. I guess almost as a validation of their specification update, and also looking to see how the higher glass performs, if there was ever any need to increase specifications potentially. I think one of the things that at the time we wanted to do was incorporate higher glass, because if glass wasn't used across the board in wearing courses, we wanted to have a bigger impact on glass stockpiles. But now VicDOT have opened it up across the board. I think in Victoria we're starting to see stockpiles diminishing rapidly, and actually there's becoming a higher demand for recycled crushed glass.
Oh, wow. I guess the next question is quite related to what you were saying, you know, stockpile reducing, and now that VicDOT has encouraged the use of it. Do you still consider this material as innovation, or probably it's under the category of business as usual?
I think it really depends on the application in which it's used. So for certain applications, I would say it's very much business as usual. And other ones, potentially it's a bit of an innovation. And maybe that's not necessarily because somebody hasn't tried it, but potentially it's because that hasn't been widely disseminated and people aren't aware of some of these other potential applications. So things that are business as usual would be glass and asphalt base course. I guess now we're moving towards business as usual in asphalt wearing course. There's been trials in the past using recycled crushed glass as a fine aggregate replacement in concrete. I wouldn't say that's business as usual, but then I'm not sure that you would say it's an innovation either, because it's been tried. During the Ostro's work, we scoured the country for interesting examples of where field trials have been undertaken, and we found some very interesting ones. And one that was particularly interesting was carried out by Central Coast Council in New South Wales, where they were trying to build 100% recycled road, and they put in a drainage layer. So between the subgrade and the subbase, they put in a 100% recycled crushed glass drainage layer. So they were stipulating that they wanted a kind of a single sized glass product, so a 2 to 5 millimeter product, to allow it to be free draining, to be free from fines. And so I think these types of applications are where the innovation lies, that there's opportunities to try something a bit different, and potentially it brings other benefits. So I think one of the things that's seen there is they've obviously screened off a certain size fraction. So they've allowed or collected material that's passing 4.75, but screened at say 2.36 millimeters. Then obviously there's some finer glass that goes through. That finer glass then is potentially much more compatible with use in concrete applications and also in asphalt wearing courses. So they've used a very specific size fraction to perform a specific function, and by doing that, they've actually created an additional glass stream that's then potentially much more suitable to some of the other applications.
Oh, okay. So it sounds like there are a lot of applications that's being, you know, that we're using recycled crushed glass. Can you probably talk a bit about what sort of composition in the mix when we use in asphalt wearing courses or even other applications?
Yeah. So, I mean, typically in asphalt, I think quite a few states are now allowing up to 10% recycled crushed glass in asphalt base course. Vic DOT 5% in asphalt wearing course. RMS New South or Transport for New South Wales, they definitely allow up to 2.5% in wearing course. Then obviously there's a lot of other applications where potentially you could use recycled crushed glass. So typically we'd be seeing that you could use up to 15% by fine aggregate replacement in a concrete for paving applications, potentially up to 30% by massive fine aggregates in non-structural concrete or for footpath and shared path applications. There's the opportunity to use significant quantities of recycled crushed glass in granular layers. So in sort of class 4 aggregates in Victoria, you could potentially use up to 50%. But we've seen in sort of class 3 materials or class 3 equivalents that we could use up to 30% recycled crushed glass blended with even other recycled materials such as crushed concrete or crushed brick and get excellent performance. So again, we've had that field trial in New South Wales that I mentioned that incorporated 30% recycled crushed glass in combination with crushed concrete. At the time in the lab, we showed that we could have gone higher, but the concern was more that there wasn't necessarily the amount of available glass that warranted us going higher, and that we start to struggle for supply.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here. Why do you choose glass? I mean, there's so many waste materials out there. I mean, why glass?
Yeah, I mean, in this case, glass is an ideal material because it's essentially equivalent to the sand size aggregate that it's replacing. Obviously, it doesn't provide an enhancement to the properties, but it has equivalent properties. And I guess one of its biggest uses is the fact that you're saving on natural resources. You don't have to quarry as much granular material. There's also a significant benefit in areas where there's potentially a lack of natural aggregate or natural sand. So specifically in urban areas, cities, so we're seeing in Melbourne and Sydney where they have to potentially bring quarried aggregates in from quite some distances, that if there's an inner city recycling plant that can crush glass to the required level, that you can save significant distances on cartage, and that's where all your sustainability benefits lie. Obviously, that doesn't preclude us incorporating other recycled materials, and there's a number of different ones that we could be utilizing in various layers of the pavement structure, which can, some of them are, I guess, replacements for virgin materials to save on the amount of virgin materials we use, and some of them can potentially modify materials to improve properties, such as chrome rubber, for example, to improve the performance of asphalt mixtures.
So it sounds like glass, it does carry a lot of benefits. Technically, it's very similar to sand size, like what you say. Environmentally, we're saving on virgin materials and also cutting down on carbon footprint because of haulage and all that. So can you tell us a bit about, if I'm a contractor now, I want to use some glass in my infrastructure, in my road construction or whatsoever. What's the process like to get more glass into my job?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a few different angles that could be taken. One of them can be the person that the job's for, or the council or the road owner. They might have some incentives to encourage the use of recycled materials, or they may be asking for contractors to innovate in terms of the quantities or percentages of recycled materials they're using. So obviously we've seen that on the Mordialloc Freeway in Victoria, that industry was asked to innovate and suggest high recycled contents within the materials that they were using. Also, it's going to be down to, I guess, contractors these days looking at available local resources where they can, again, save money on potentially buying premium aggregates, or save money on cartage, and therefore they could well be seeing that there's a local processor of recycled crushed glass that would give them significant benefits over a quarry that would be significant distance away. And obviously, I guess one of the main advocates of that in Victoria would be Alex Fraser, that obviously have recycling facilities and asphalt plants at the same site.
A lot of people are still very wary about the use of glass. You know, is it safe? I think safety at work is very important to anybody.
Yeah. And obviously that's one of the major concerns, I guess, with any recycled material, but we need to be taking into account worker health and safety, also potential risk to community. I guess the glass has had a bit of a stigma over the years in terms of the way it was processed and potentially not being to such a fine particle size, potentially having larger flaky particles or even shard-like particles, and people used to complain of cuts, etc. These days, the materials processed to a 4.75 mil passing product. I should have. I meant to have a sample on my desk. I can see it. I've left it on the table over here. I'll just go and grab it. But essentially, now we're talking about a very finely processed material. So this is a typical recycled crushed glass, if people can see. And so it's made up of essentially almost cubical sample size, a graded product, passing 4.75 millimeters down to 75 microns and below. And it will replace that sand-sized component in mixes, be that concrete, asphalt mixture, or granular materials. So I think from the cuts perspective, that it shouldn't be an issue. Obviously, when we're handling aggregates and construction materials, we should be wearing appropriate PPE anyway. So ideally, we should be wearing safety boots, we should be wearing gloves. I guess another question that always comes up about recycled crushed glass is silicosis. Given that glass is essentially silicon dioxide, but glass is made up of amorphous silica, so it doesn't contain any crystalline silica that's the risk associated with silicosis. So that's actually has less crystalline silica in it than natural aggregates. So from that perspective, again, it's a lower risk material. I guess the last kind of area where people have concerns over glass is odor. Obviously, glass is coming from food and beverage containers generally. If it's not washed, it can have, I guess, residual sugars on it and start to create a smell. And then it's all about how you manage that. So in New South Wales, typically they wash all the recycled crushed glass, and therefore odor is a minimal risk. Whereas in Victoria, we're seeing some suppliers washing their glass, other ones not, and people are getting just as good performance whether they wash the glass or not. So then it's about managing it. So for example, asphalt plants potentially could be giving off more odors than usual. Typically, asphalt plants are away from residential areas, so that mitigates that kind of risk. I think there's maybe a minor increased or slightly different smell from an asphalt that contains recycled crushed glass. So I've been at a site where asphalt's gone down, and I didn't really notice much difference over conventional asphalt. I guess again, it's in a fairly small percentage of the total mix. One of the areas where potentially there's more concern over unwashed glass is things like bedding and backfill, where you're using 100% recycled crushed glass and you need to try and work that material. So under those circumstances, I've heard that workers have complained of a slightly unpleasant smell. And the other issue is if it's unwashed, it can be quite difficult to work because it's quite sticky. So I think obviously it's all about understanding what the implications are of things like washing and managing that in conjunction with your workers and also what you're trying to achieve in your particular job.
I think looking back at the little jars of crushed glass that you had, I'm almost inclined to say the chances of me being cut by just rubbing my hands on, I mean, this is bad practice, okay? Rubbing my hands on some aggregate, like virgin aggregate with all the different angles, I think the chances of me getting a cut is probably higher than if I were to rub my hands across this 4.75 millimeter of glass. But once again, I'm not suggesting that, because we should always be wearing PPE and gloves and all that. So I'm just mindful of time, so I'll probably move on to the next question. So what challenges and barriers do you think the industry is facing, and how should we overcome them?
Yeah, I guess the main barriers to the use of recycled crushed glass is potentially awareness over how and where it can be used. I think people know that, you know, most of the more common uses of recycled crushed glass, but maybe some of the more unusual uses of recycled crushed glass people aren't necessarily aware of, or aware of how to use it in that fashion or manage it. And so obviously knowledge sharing sessions like this one, there's the Ostroads webinar that's still available, free to download or free to watch. There's plenty of resources out there, such as, again, AARB produces a number of best practice guides on the use of recycled materials that provide information about how best to use glass, where best to use it, and where you're likely to get the best advantages. I guess the other, I guess, major barrier now is the availability of recycled crushed glass. It's now becoming a demanded material, and we could end up with not having enough supply. That could be down to the fact that there's still not enough people processing the glass. So I think that's an opportunity to have more industry that's actually capable of recycling the material to the required level.
In a line or two, James, what about performance? You know, how does this material perform?
Yeah, I probably should start off by covering one of the things that I didn't mention before, and that's the use of recycled crushed glass in concrete. That's a bit of a special case that I would suggest that washing the glass, you're likely to get much better performance. So the sugars that are on the unwashed glass are potentially detrimental to the cementing action. And you would see a lower strength in a concrete that potentially was contaminated with high levels of sugar. But if you're treating, or if you're washing your glass and you've got very low levels of contamination, there should be no reason why adding up to 15% recycled crushed glass fines in concrete that you won't get equivalent performance over the concrete without. And again, in terms of asphalt, at the levels that we're incorporating it at, the recycled crushed glass performs exactly the same way as the natural aggregate, and therefore the material should perform just the same as a control asphalt without the glass. And in some of the granular materials, we're actually seeing that you could adjust a poor or marginal material that maybe had grading deficiencies or PI, like potentially very high PIs. You could treat that kind of mechanically by blending with glass, improve the gradation, potentially decrease the PI, and actually get better performance out of granular materials. So it's all about knowing the material that you've got in the first place, knowing what's best to blend it with, and how to get the best results out of it.
And of course, there's probably specifications and processes in place that people can follow. Yeah, I can see that Cheryl's turned on the camera, and we've got lots of questions from our audience today. So Cheryl, maybe you over to you to start asking those questions.
I think, you know, it's a challenge today because there's so much information, but I think we will again do a follow-up email. Someone's asking about a specification now. ecologiQ has one that has been, it's not, I just checked, it's not yet on our website, but it's probably just the website refreshing. So that we'll send that out to everyone afterwards.
And there's also the Ostrodes specification for recycled crushed glass sand, which is ATS 3050, I think, which is free to download from the Ostrodes website.
So we'll put those links into the email as well. I'll chat to you, James, about them afterwards, but I'll just run through these questions. Someone was asking about supply cost and OH&S. I think you've covered the OH&S. I'm not sure.
Supply costs. Typically, you would say that the recycled crushed glass sand is going to be ballpark around the same as the natural aggregate is replacing per ton. So typically, we've been seeing $20 per ton, that kind of ballpark figure. Although it depends a bit on supply and demand, and potentially things could be negotiated. I think I've heard that maybe the Central Coast Council's job, they were maybe getting their glass at much lower costs, maybe like $12 to $15 a ton. But then dependent on supply, potentially you might end up paying a bit more. So it's all about sort of market fluctuations, but typically similar to the natural aggregate that it's replacing. So then it gets back to the question of haulage, probably.
And did you mention much about supply earlier? I was checking a few things on the web.
Yeah, I mentioned the fact that, you know, obviously now we've opened up glass and asphalt wearing course, that we're starting to see a lack of supply, and maybe now we need more processing facilities to treat recycled crushed glass. Or create more recycled crushed glass from bottles that can't be recycled. So I think obviously the more that people are aware, the less there's going to be stockpiles, and therefore it's all about understanding supply and demand again. I know ecologiQ have the recycled materials suppliers map, so that's something to bear in mind. And again, potentially in certain parts of regional Victoria, it might be much harder to get hold of if there's no local processor. And again, you're likely to lose those sustainability benefits if you have to bring your glass in from a long way away.
Yeah, Daniel was actually asking about that. Is there any industry planning to improve that availability outside the metro areas in more regional? Or is it kind of demand based?
Yeah, I guess potentially that's down to pressures on recycling in regional locations. I think we had some discussions with City of Ballarat at one point that, again, there was maybe a lack of local recycled crushed glass. There was some talks maybe with a local recycler whether they would consider setting up a processing facility. So potentially it's down another one that I can think of. We had some discussions with Macedon Ranges that, again, were collecting their glass, but they didn't have a way to process it. They were looking into whether they could get hold of a mobile crushing facility to be able to process their own glass and potentially even share that glass then amongst neighbouring shire councils for rehabilitation jobs. Those
mini sort of factories sound like a good idea in a few spaces. Someone was asking about, and I think this is sort of covered when you talked about the OH&S, but can we adopt a similar approach to New South Wales for a regulated supply of glass to enforce testing of glass and ask for washing as mandatory, and as we are currently facing contaminated water runoff through use of unwashed glass?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, this one. I think obviously certain applications, washing is a better approach for recycled crushed glass. But from a sustainability standpoint, it's actually less sustainable to have to go through that extra process. It adds a cost. And then the question is it really that necessary? I think the contaminants that are coming off glass, we're only talking about sugars, potentially, that things that are going to be fairly minor contaminants, and it's not contaminated with heavy metals or things that are of significant concern from an EPA perspective.
Yeah, cool. Do you think using glass in pavements will cause more wearing to the tyres compared to normal conventional aggregates? And I'll add this other one, is there any benefit to wearing coarse friction?
Yeah, so I think the answer is no. Essentially, the glass will act very similar to the natural aggregate it's replacing, and you wouldn't notice it was even there, except for potentially seeing a little bit more glint on the pavement surface. So the particles are so fine that they're not sharp, and therefore they're not going to cause any additional wear to tires. Potentially you've been driving on quite a few roads that have already contained recycled crushed glass for local government councils anyway, and maybe not even noticed it.
So is there any benefit to wearing coarse friction?
Yeah, so in terms of, I don't think it gives any additional benefit in terms of friction. As I mentioned, we did work with OmniGrip to look at incorporating recycled crushed glass into a high friction surface treatment. So that's a much different approach. So that's taking again, a kind of a single sized glass, but blending it with a single sized corundum aggregate to create a high friction surface treatment. And under those circumstances, obviously you're going to get much significant improvements in frictional properties, but those are surface treatments that are applied at coming up to traffic intersections or at safety black spots.
So just a couple more. What would you say would be a reasonable percentage for both washed and unwashed glass in practice these days?
I think there's no differences between the percentages for washed or unwashed. I don't think there's anything that says that if it's not washed that the percentage needs to be lower. There's just certain things that you need to be mindful of if you're using unwashed glass. So I guess those are the things like, potential odor issues or potential workability issues if you were using it as 100% granular material. So then it's all about managing that, I think. So
yeah. With the changing climate, extreme weather, using recycled glass sand as an embedment, is it safe and no specs difficulties with operational issues during maintenance of the stormwater drainage?
Yeah, I guess again, in general terms, it's going to act much the same way as any other material. Obviously, in stormwater drains, there's always that issue that you're going to get a certain amount of aggregate that gets washed through into drains, and therefore it will be the same for glass. But then glass is essentially an inert material, much the same as any other aggregate, so it doesn't cause significant contamination if it gets into, or it gets washed away through stormwater. I think that's probably the best way to answer that one.
Yeah, and I guess it'd be like little sand granules at the bottom.
I mean, exactly. It would end up being ground down to be much like looking like sand on the beach almost.
Yeah. And the last one we've got here is any progress using RCG powder as a cement replacement?
Yeah, that's one thing that obviously I didn't touch on today. And there is obviously that opportunity to grind glass down to a very fine powder and give it a pozzolanic property. I think potentially the issues there is at the moment with so many other pozzolans around, like fly ash, etc., that there's not really the need or the demand, and therefore the processing to grind it fine enough to give it that pozzolanic reaction is probably cost prohibitive. It's not to say it couldn't be done, And I guess one of the things that we're looking at the moment is things like hydrated lime supply issues. And obviously, if people were able to process the glass to fine enough quantities in a volume that made it cost competitive, then certainly it's something that's worth looking at.
I think when it comes to glass, it's always what's the higher value use of glass?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously if it's used as a pozzolan, it's essentially a higher value use, but the processing to put it to that use potentially outweighs the potential benefits if there's other available materials.
Okay.
But it's not to say that it couldn't be done and isn't being looked at.
Right. There is a follow-up to the previous question on washed and unwashed. Is there a reasonable percentage, not acknowledging the difference, is there any reasonable percentage for both?
I would say it's probably more about which applications that you would choose to use washed versus unwashed in. My viewpoint is that I would probably steer clear of using unwashed glass in concrete applications. I think, again, there's been some research trials to suggest that there shouldn't be too much issue, but my view is I would take a more conservative approach and want my glass washed in that application. I think in certain bedding and backfill applications, depending on the volumes of glass that you were using and the type of compaction you were after, potentially you might be better off having washed glass. Also, if you're undertaking that kind of work in a residential area, it was probably preferable to have it washed because you don't want to be upsetting the residents. Therefore, using 100% recycled crushed glass for those applications unwashed is better away from residential areas, so potentially more in industrial areas or remote areas. I think that's probably the most I can say on that one.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, there is so much information and we are limited always in time with these, but the idea is to give you some core information for you to explore. What we'll do today is follow up from this. We'll get some information from James. I'll put some links in. We'll add the ecologiQ's recycled crushed glass technical note that is fresh off the presses. And yeah, so we'll have a look at a package of information for you. James is happy for you to contact him. You can contact us if you want, ecologiq@roadprojects.vic.gov.au, or we have got our website. I'll just share my screen if I can do this successfully.
I should have probably put up my email as well, shouldn't I?
Yeah, so I'll put, I'll add your email. Is that the question screen? I got the right one up. So I'll add your email to what we send out to people. So if you're okay with that, happy for any
but essentially it's just james.grenfell@aarb.com.au. But we can make sure it's supplying.
Great, thank you. And look, if there are any questions or any further session you'd like to do it on a specific glass application after today, we're happy to also look at that.